Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to this panel discussion. Thank you so much for joining us here today. In this session, we will be looking at the Central Asian experience with repatriation and rehabilitation of women and children related to extremist groups and the possible lessons to be learned. This panel discussion is organized as a part of Geneva Peace Week 2021, jointly by the Bulan Institute of Peace Innovations and the Fight for Humanity. The Bulan Institute is a non-profit and independent peace-building organization that works through policy research, analysis, and publishing with a regional focus on Central Asia, South Asia, and Eurasia. Fight for Humanity, on the other hand, is an international non-profit NGO that has been working on Syria since 2012 and has developed important knowledge on the conflict dynamics by directly engaging with the Syrian Democratic Forces, as well as several other actors. We are absolutely thrilled that you could join us here for this discussion as a part of the digital series session of the Geneva Peace Week. I am Keshav Khanna, and I am a research assistant with the Bulan Institute. So here's what this session is all about. Following the establishment of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in 2014, more than 40,000 foreign terrorist fighters from 110 different countries, predominantly from the Middle East, North Africa, Western and Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, traveled to the conflict zone. After the fall of ISIS, about 70,000 women and children, who were family members of ISIS fighters, were trapped in Northeast Syria, where they were placed in the Al-Hol and Al Roj camps, and since have been held by the Syrian Democratic Forces. These camps have quite dire conditions and pose a significant security challenge. This situation has prompted the current international dilemma about what should be done with these ISIS fighters and their family members. Now, states have an international legal obligation to protect and repatriate their nationals, especially women and children. The UN Security Council Resolution 2397 urges all countries to assist women and children associated with foreign terrorist fighters who may be victims of terrorism themselves, and to do so considering the impact of age and gender on their vulnerability. Despite this, the repatriation processes all over the globe have been rather slow. But we do see traces of good practices emerge from Central Asia. 4 countries in particular, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, have facilitated the return of over 1,300 people to the region. So, with our panel of experts here today, we aim to explore these experiences with repatriation and rehabilitation in the region and trace the emerging evidence of good practices and early successes. So without any further ado, let me introduce our 5 exemplary guests for this panel discussion. We have with us Ms. Anki Sjoberg, co-director and founder for the Fight for Humanity. Ms. Christina Matei, program manager for capacity building programs at Hadeya. Dr. Ahmad El Mohammadi, assistant professor at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization and associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism. Ms. Cholpo Norozobekova, director of the Bulan Institute for Peace Innovations, and Ms. Gulnaz Razdikova, director at the Center for Analysis and Development of Interconfessional Relations. Thank you all for being here with us today. The format of the session is as follows. Our experts will provide us with a brief presentation. Then we will follow this with a question and answer session. Here, we will dig a bit deeper into each of our panelists' area of expertise on this very interesting topic. First, I would like to invite Ms. Anki Sjoberg, the co-director and the founder of Fight for Humanity, to give us a global overview of the current situation with ISIS associates. Ms. Sjoberg holds a PhD from the Graduate Institute right here in Geneva and has a cumulative 17 years of experience working in the nonprofit sector on issues linked to conflict, security, armed groups, and gender. Ms. Sjoberg, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. So in this introduction, I will explain why we think that the topic here is important that we're going to discuss today, and why we should learn from these different experiences specifically. So first of all, I think many people in the audience are aware that in addition to the conflict situation and the conflict violence in Syria, the country is also suffering from an economic crisis, water and food insecurity, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And the situation is even more dramatic for the ISIS-related women and children who are held in the Al-Hol and Roj camps in Northeast Syria, where some around 70,000 people are being held, many since 2 or more years. They are suffering from limited access to basic services, including food and health, and from arbitrary deprivation of liberty in an area that is representing a constant and growing security risk due to the presence of armed actors, criminal elements, which is a risk not only to them, but also to the NGOs that are trying to provide for their needs in these camps. The inhabitants of the camps are facing extreme humanitarian needs, both physical and mental. Some of them are wounded, sick, malnourished, traumatized, scared, demoralized, etc. The children specifically in these camps are at risk of statelessness, trafficking, indefinite detention, and have very limited access to education. In a recent report from the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, the report even argued that the conditions in the camps strongly suggest that the most basic human rights of those confined there, such as the rights to health and to food, are being violated. And the Commission further argued that the conditions in Al-Hol camps in particular may amount to cruel or inhuman treatment, which would be a war crime. In the same report, they argue for the immediate repatriation of foreign nationals who are allegedly associated with ISIS, and in particular, the children with their mothers, in accordance with the best interest of the child, but also in light of the dire camp conditions. So we know that the majority of the children in the camps are Syrian and Iraqis, but still, as of June 2021, some 7,800 children from nearly 60 other countries were still being held. So why is the issue of repatriation and rehabilitation of these women and children so important? So the report of the Commission of Inquiry that I just quoted reflects the rights perspective, in the sense that everyone has the equal rights to enjoy our human rights. And we would like to echo the rights perspective here, because you can never lose your basic rights to food, health, etc., whatever your ideological choices. And in this specific context, we know that the children have not made any choices. And even if they had done so, children can only be detained as a last resort. We know also that some of the children have been separated from their mothers, are being held in separate centers. So by depriving these women or children of their rights, we are putting into question the collective gains that we have made in human rights during the last decades, which is a dangerous path to go. Moreover, there needs to be a legal process that guarantees access to justice for those allegedly responsible for international humanitarian law crimes and human rights abuses, as well as access to truth and justice for the victims. But there are no criminal charges against the vast majority of the people in these camps, and they are entitled to support and should be returned to safe environments. So in terms of arguments linked to peace and stability, we think that the rights of victims of ISIS are not furthered by creating new victims, of which an overwhelming majority are innocent and have committed no crimes. So we know by now quite well what types of situations and circumstances create violent extremism and belonging. And we know that the search for belonging is the most human of needs. In fact, we know that human beings react physically to threats against their identity in a way that is very similar to the way we react to physical threats. So identity is central to our very existence, but still sometimes people are misled in their search for identity and belonging. But we need to be able to include these people again, otherwise we fail not only them, but also our own security and the security of others, as we risk creating new generations of persons who have grown up in exclusion, poverty, deprivation, and violence. That is, we would be playing into the hands of extremist groups that will want to recruit these people in the future. So we think that we can approach the issue under discussion today, both from a rights perspective and from a human security perspective. And we will see that both approaches will lead us to the same path, the path of resocialization, normalization, reintegration, and support, and not that one of exclusion and punishment. So today's event is important from a human perspective, but also from a peace-building perspective, as we are going to look at experiences of inclusion, of bringing people back into the community and creating just societies. And this event is also shows how we can help building peace through research analysis of fact, discussion, and evidence-based advocacy based on things that we can see that are working. It's also an example of what is called hope-based communication. That is a way of trying to highlight the need to focus on providing solutions, and not just focusing on the problems, and showing what we stand for, what we want to see, and not just what we don't want to see. So the experience here today are going to be very valuable to take into account because we're going to look at countries that have been working and have been implementing successful experiences of what others may claim is not possible. But this is not about stigmatizing countries or approaches. It's really about looking at finding positive narratives, encouraging example, seeing how we can solve what we know is an extremely complex problem, but we also know it's not a problem that is going to disappear if we ignore it. It's going to become a bigger problem. So we know that this issue touches upon the lives and the futures of thousands, or maybe perhaps millions of people, as well as the prospect for peace in the region, notably in Syria and Iraq, but also in the home countries of the foreign women and children. And it's very relevant, I think, particularly now that Iraq has started repatriating their citizens, even if it's just a portion of them, but to try to see basically what are the experiences that can be shared from other contexts. So in short, this event is about underlining the principles of everyone's equal rights, the importance of the human approach to security, and of learning from the successes and challenges of the real life human rights heroes that work to make these principles a reality. And that said, I very much look forward to hearing from our speakers today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Shobat, for starting us off. Indeed, the current situation is quite serious, and it does demand united and urgent peace-building efforts from the entire international community. Let's now turn a bit to the experience of Central Asian states, where the 4 countries that we mentioned before have carried out large-scale operations and brought back hundreds of their citizens. The Bulan Institute has been studying their experiences and has written extensively on this topic. So let's turn to Ms. Cholpon Rozabekova, Director of the Bulan Institute, to give us more of an insight into the repatriation and rehabilitation programs in the region. Ms. Rozabekova, could you also tell us a bit about the good practices and lessons learned from Central Asia?
Thank you very much, Keshaf. I would like to thank our experts for joining us today. So today we will, Bulan Institute has been observing and researching experiences of Central Asian countries. 4 countries repatriated their citizens, mainly women and children. So this photo was taken in May 2019 during the Operation Mehr, which means kindness in Uzbek. This photo is taken at the airport of Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and the woman who just arrived in Tashkent kissing the land. And so you can see other women and children who just arrived from Syria, from Northeastern Syria. And as Ms. Anke Sjoberg said, in Al-Hol and Al Roj camps, currently there are 70,000 women and children. So 45% of them Syrians and 40% of them are Iraqis, and about 12,000 represent more than 50 countries. So there are foreigners, and male fighters are in prisons near Hasaki. So United Nations started calling countries to repatriate their citizens, mainly women and children, and also international NGOs have been calling. And after that call, Central Asian states have taken a lead. So first Kazakhstan, which started repatriating, and then Uzbekistan followed. So in general, between 5,000 and 7,000 people from Central Asia traveled to Middle East to join ISIS. So all countries framed the operation as humanitarian. So they said that we are saving lives of our citizens. It's our people. And second narrative was about these people were misled and deceived. So when it comes to the approaches of each country, Tajikistan was the first country that have taken the soft approach. In 2015, Tajikistan already announced full amnesty for those who will return voluntarily and confess. And Uzbekistan repatriated since 2019 435 people, mainly only women and children. So Uzbekistan didn't repatriate male fighters. Kazakhstan carried out the big-scale operation. More than 700 citizens of Kazakhstan repatriated, and including men, 37 men returned. And when it comes to Kyrgyzstan, it was the last country in Central Asia which repatriated, and mainly only children from Iraqi prisons. So here you can see the number of repatriates by country. So as you can see in Kazakhstan, for example, Kazakhstan actually carried out 2 operations, Jusan and Rusafa. Rusafa brought back only children from Iraq. So total number is 722. And Uzbekistan, you can see also from Iraq, from both countries, Iraq and Syria. And Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, 2 countries repatriated only children from Iraqi prisons. So let's talk about first about Operation Mehr of Uzbekistan. So you can see in this photo, a woman, Uzbek woman, just arrived with 3 children. And law enforcement agencies, social workers started assisting. And so Uzbekistan's model of rehabilitation based on the principle of family and community life, because compared to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan didn't create any additional shelters, so which allows them to avoid expensive costs. For example, Uzbekistan created rehabilitation centers, 17 rehabilitation centers across the country in different regions to assist returnees. But Uzbekistan's model is based on rely mainly on family members. So which means after 1 month quarantine, women and children, they relocate to home communities and they join their family members. So family members should support them. And many female returnees, they live together with their grandparents or parents or sisters. So they join their family members, and also in the community level, there are the system that helps to women to integrate. And there was a needs assessment and to integrate this woman. And so professional courses organized for women to find a job. And also some short professional courses and professional courses, 4 months, for example, for those who had already diploma to refresh their education, their knowledge. So for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, they carried out 1 operation to bring back children. So for Tajikistan, 84 children returned from Iraq, and there is an inter-ministerial working group that coordinates between 12 state bodies. And what is really remarkable, all countries, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan also, they worked jointly with international agencies, UNICEF and ICRC. And when it comes to Kyrgyzstan, for example, it was the last country to repatriate. And what was good for Kyrgyzstan conducted internal meetings with other countries to learn their experiences. So there was an exchange of good practices, and a working group that was sent to Iraq. They spent 20 days in Iraq for resolving all operational issues. But before sending this group, Kyrgyzstan met with relatives of children, and there was 2 conditions for repatriation. 1 condition is consent of their mothers who are serving their terms in Iraqi prisons. And 2nd condition was consent of relatives to adopt these children. So when these 2 conditions met, and then child can be repatriated. But in Tajikistan's case, they didn't work with relatives. So now many of children, they are still in the orphanage. So many relatives, without this kind of work and preparing them to adopt these children, many relatives, they are still refusing to take these children. So Operation Jusan of Kazakhstan, it's a boy who was repatriated, orphan boy, repatriated from Northeast Syria, from Camp Al-Hol. And so Operation Jusan of Kazakhstan was carried out in 5 phases. And the Kazakhstan's operation is the most institutionalized and state-led. And so they frame it as a humanitarian operation, saying that we are saving the lives of our citizens. And but all repatriated men, they were arrested immediately and charged with terrorism charges. But after the legal assessment, 13 women also had been arrested, because Kazakh authorities, they had clear evidences that they committed crime in the Middle East. So what is really important in Kazakhstan's case, Kazakhstan managed to mobilize theologians, religious leaders, doctors, social workers, psychologists to work with the returnees. And also, I would like to highlight effective media strategy that Kazakhstan built to prevent stigmatization. They really started working with media from the beginning. They created the pool of journalists, and then they managed to convey their narrative to the population. And so Gulnaz will talk about the Kazakhstan's case in details. So I will talk about mainly on resocialization, because it's very important. So first case, important steps were restoring all documents, and 30% of children were born in Syria, and it was really difficult task to make the documents for them. And there were very good strategies. For example, one I would like to mention, that women were allowed to choose a place of birth for their children. So they have taken the cities of Kazakhstan instead of Syria. So the documents don't mention Syria as a birthplace. It was a good strategy to avoid stigmatization in the future. And children, of course, they started going to school. And as I mentioned, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan also, they organized professional courses for women as a cooker, driver, manicurist, dressmaker, so they can find a job. So in both countries, many women, they found a job now. They are working, and some of them, they have small businesses. So here are some photos from the rehabilitation centers in Kazakhstan. So you can see that children are drawing, and there is a medical assistance, and also sessions with psychologists and best practices. So I would like to highlight how Central Asian countries managed to minimize stigmatization. So through the building right narratives and conveying them to the population. And also mobilization of local specialists, psychologists, social workers, and they were already trained and they were already ready to work with returnees beforehand. It was a really good approach. And I would like to highlight collaborative partnership with civil society organizations. Usually Central Asian countries, they are well known for their crackdown on freedom of speech and NGOs, but this time governments, they decided that they are not going to, they can't deal alone with this. So they started working with their civil society organizations. And operational qualities are very important, thorough preparation of every step of repatriation and rehabilitation programs, and holistic approach. So starting from the initial quarantine, medical checks, psychological assistance, and involvement of all specialists, and also involvement of theologians to work on the ideological part. So drawbacks and limitations, of course, there are some problems. And first of all, it's the short-term nature of the repatriation programs, because there is the limit of financial resources and human resources. And shortage of resources also impact the process of rehabilitation. And maybe we can ask Gulnaz about this, but we have information that some countries, they are stopping supporting the rehabilitation programs because of the shortage of resources. And remaining social grievances of returnees, of course, because there is poverty, there is unemployment, and some of them, they decided to go to the Middle East because of these social problems. But governments should take more relevant policies to tackle these problems. And of course, there is still stigmatization within society because some people still think that they shouldn't be returned, they shouldn't be here, and they blame them still, and some of them are afraid of them. So stigmatization is there. And of course, the impact of the COVID-19, and it's amazing how Gulnaz Razdekova, for example, who is present with us today, she worked she launched along the program Zoom Jusan during the quarantine time, and she worked online with returnees, female returnees. But of course, COVID pandemic had huge impact on the rehabilitation process. So I stop here and thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, of course, I will answer during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rozubekova, for your insightful and detailed presentation. Perhaps, as we discussed before, we could look into one of the cases of studies here, Kazakhstan, for instance, because we have the pleasure of having Ms. Gulnaz Razdekova with us. She is a director of the Center for Analysis and Development of Interconfessional Relations, which is actually based in Kazakhstan. And she has been actively involved in the rehabilitation and reintegration of women and children in her country. As Ms. Rozubekova already mentioned, she launched the National Zoom Jushan project to work online with female returnees during the pandemic. Ms. Razdekova speaks Kazakh and Russian, and to facilitate her interventions, we've asked her to pre-record her presentation and have added English subtitles. During the question and answer, her comments will be translated for us by Ms. Rozubekova.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Большое спасибо за то, что вы меня пригласили в качестве спикера для выступления на данной экспертной площадке. Я знаю, что на сегодняшний день данная экспертная площадка является одной из самых авторитетных. Меня зовут Раздыкова Гульназ, я представляю Республику Казахстан. Я психолог, руковожу реабилитационным центром в городе Павлодар, Республики Казахстан. Сегодня я постараюсь быть для вас максимально полезной и поделиться своим опытом реабилитации и реинтеграции женщин, эвакуированных из зон террористической активности. Я сама непосредственно работала с этими женщинами с момента их возвращения по настоящее время. Всего Казахстан реализовал 5 этапов операции «Жусан». Самый последний этап операции «Жусан» произошел 5 февраля текущего года, когда с территории Сирии было эвакуировано 12 человек. За весь период операции «Жусан» в Республику Казахстан было эвакуировано 603 человека, из них 37 мужчин, 157 женщин и 413 ребенок. Из 413 детей на сегодняшний день сиротами являются 34 ребенка. Операция «Жусан» началась 5 января и продлилась до 26 июня 2019 года. Кроме операции «Жусан», с 27 по 28 ноября 2019 года наше правительство реализовало гуманитарную операцию под названием «Русафа». Цель данной операции – это эвакуация детей, матери которых отбывают тюремное наказание в иракских тюрьмах. На сегодняшний день добровольно женщины вернули своим ближайшим родственникам 14 детей, из них 6 мальчиков и 8 девочек. На сегодняшний день все дети воспитываются и находятся у своих бабушек и дедушек. Следует отметить, что согласно статье 10 Конституции Республики Казахстан у нас предусмотрено лишение гражданства, если судебными органами доказана причастность гражданина к террористическим организациям. Но наша страна не воспользовалась данной поправкой, в отношении ни одного гражданина. То есть все 600 эвакуированных человек не были лишены гражданства. Согласно национальному законодательству по борьбе с терроризмом и религиозным экстремизмом, то есть те граждане, по которым доказана их причастность в участии боевых действий на стороне запрещенной террористической организации ИГИЛ, а также вербовочной деятельности, они привлекаются к уголовной ответственности. На сегодняшний день к уголовной ответственности привлечено 33 мужчины и 17 женщин. Женщин в основном приговаривают к условным срокам наказания, чтобы не отрывать их от воспитания своих детей. Операции «Жусан» предшествовала огромная подготовительная работа. В первую очередь это законодательные изменения. Была принята государственная программа по противодействию религиозному экстремизму и терроризму с 2018 по 2022 годы. Также были внесены изменения в Уголовный кодекс Республики Казахстан, согласно которому уголовная ответственность за участие в террористическом акциях начинается не с 16 лет, как было это ранее, а с 14 лет. Был расширен состав преступлений террористического характера. Во-вторых, с 2017 года в городе Нур-Султан состоялись многоуровневые переговорочные процессы по сирийскому вопросу. Следующее. Был изучен опыт других государств по дерадикализации и реинтеграции женщин. Также нашей страной активизировалась работа в социальных сетях по удалению либо блокированию нежелательного контента, который распространяли экстремистскую идеологию. Следующее. Судебным решением Республики Казахстан были запрещены на территории нашей страны следующие международные террористические организации, такие как Исламское государство, Фронт Ан-Нусра и Ат-Такфир Уаль-Хиджра. Также нашей страной были депортированы так называемые проповедники экстремистской идеологии. Они сейчас отбывают наказание в исправительных учреждениях. Была укреплена материально-техническая база реабилитационных центров, были организованы курсы по подготовке и переподготовке специалистов, теологов, религиоведов, психологов и социальных работников. Медийная политика операции «Жусан» была открыта, многие судебные процессы были освещены в СМИ. Сами репатриантки давали интервью, контактировали с журналистами, в том числе и зарубежными. На сегодняшний день об операции «Жусан» вышло около 700 печатных и электронных материалов. Все эти материалы находятся в открытом доступе Женщин, выехавших на территорию Сирии, условно можно разделить на 4 большие категории. Первая категория – это женщины, которые уехали вслед за своими мужьями. Вторая категория – это женщины, которые уехали по собственной инициативе. Третья категория женщин – это те женщины, которые на момент начала боевых действий в Сирии уже находились на Ближнем Востоке. И четвертая категория женщин – это светские женщины, это те женщины, которые не разделяли никакие религиозные убеждения, а поехали вслед за своими сыновьями либо братьями. Все женщины первоначально прошли 30-дневный карантин в адаптационном лагере в городе Ахтау. Там с ними работали по нескольким направлениям. В первую очередь это документирование данных женщин. Второй этап – это медицинское обследование данных женщин и проведение геномных экспертиз для установления факта родства между матерями и детьми. Также с ними работали психологи, социальные работники и теологи. Этот период позволил женщинам максимально безболезненно вернуться по месту своего проживания. Женщины приехали физически истощенными и эмоционально слабыми. Поэтому для того, чтобы эффективно их реинтегрировать в общество, необходима была усиленная психологическая поддержка. Там проводилась групповая терапия с женщинами и индивидуальные мероприятия. Также с помощью теологов женщины уже на момент нахождения в адаптационном лагере Ахтау отказались от многих радикальных религиозных убеждений, на которых они находились. Такие понятия, как хиджа, джихад, такфир, тагут были рассмотрены девочками уже в адаптационном лагере. После 30-дневного пребывания в адаптационном лагере все женщины вернулись в свои семьи по месту проживания. На сегодняшний день, несмотря на условия пандемии, реабилитационные мероприятия с женщинами продолжаются. Они продолжаются с позиции Республиканского общественного объединения «Ахмелет». Я сама реализую большой проект, который называется «Zoom Жусан», где 2 раза в неделю мы с женщинами собираемся для встречи с психологами и с теологами. Необходимость реализации данного проекта обусловлена условиями пандемии, которая была в нашей стране. Многие женщины прошли курсы подготовки, многие женщины прошли профессиональные курсы подготовки и переподготовки. Женщины работают, либо получили грантовое финансирование на открытие своего индивидуального дела. Также детям на сегодняшний день все дети, эвакуированные по операции Жусан, охвачены дошкольным и школьным образованием. Они все посещают школьные учреждения, либо детские сады. У них сейчас идет процесс социализации. Несмотря на то, что круг интересов многих женщин на сегодняшний день ограничен семейными делами, они усиленно заняты воспитанием своих детей, группа женщин изъявила желание создать волонтерский корпус для того, чтобы помогать нам, специалистам, по дерадикализации других женщин. Также эти женщины представляют нашу страну на международных площадках, и себя на сегодняшний день эти женщины позиционируют себя не как жертвы терроризма, а как борцы против терроризма. Группа женщин-волонтеров, репатриантов открыли себе аккаунты в социальных сетях и в информационном пространстве занимаются контрпропагандой идеологии террористической организации Даиш и других экстремистских организаций. Я считаю, что это один из самых действенных и показательных результатов их успешной реинтеграции в наше общество. Все женщины, на сегодняшний день все женщины отказались от радикальных религиозных взглядов. Да, безусловно, для всех женщин была создана по моменту в 2019 году, на момент уже по возвращению на место жительства, для всех женщин были созданы условия, чтобы пройти курсы повышения квалификации, либо переквалификации по специальности. В основном девочки выбирали курсы швей, парикмахеры, массажный салон, маникюрные услуги. На сегодняшний день у нас есть несколько успешных кейсов, когда девочки брали гранты на открытие своего собственного бизнеса. В частности, одна из женщин открыла кондитерский цех по производству сладостей на основе рецептов правильного питания. Сейчас она она сейчас достаточно хорошо раскрутила свой бизнес-аккаунт и через Инстаграм занимается продажей, так скажем, правильных кондитерских изделий. Одна из женщин открыла парикмахерский салон в городе Кызылорде. Тоже обучилась на парикмахера, занимается колористикой, стрижками. Одна из женщин у нас открыла швейный цех и занимается пошивом рабочей одежды, спецодежды по запросу организации.
Thank you, Ms. Razdikova, for your professional work with returnees and for sharing your experience with us. It is indeed quite fascinating, as both you and Ms. Rozubikova mentioned, that there are many good practices that we can learn from Kazakhstan, which has a very, very comprehensive operational plan there. Now we move on to our international expert to learn about the shared experiences of other countries in other regions. Our next panelist is Dr. Ahmad Al-Mohammadi. He is the assistant professor at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization in Malaysia. He is also an associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism. Since 2011, I beg your pardon, he works closely with the Counterterrorism Division of the Royal Malaysian Police and Prison Department to implement the Rehabilitation and De-radicalization program for individuals detained under the terrorism laws in Malaysia. Dr. Al-Mohammadi is also a member of the De-radicalization panel and specialist appointed by the Ministry of Home Affairs in Malaysia. So Dr. Al-Mohammadi, could you please share with us the experience of Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia, and on what kind of state approaches are in place to deal with ISIS fighters and their family members? And do you think there are some good practices in Central Asia for other countries and for Southeast Asian states to learn from?
Yes, thank you very much, Keshaf, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, my co-panelists. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thought on this issue. In this discussion, I would like to mention three things. First is the background of the returnees in Malaysia. And second is the strategies and approaches taken by Malaysia in dealing with the returnees. And the last one, some challenges. So within this time frame, let me go to the first one. That is some background on the issue that we have here. It is very fascinating that we are facing the same problem. I mean, look at the shell point presentation just now. In Europe, they have these problems of the people are traveling to the conflict zone. We are in the Southeast Asia, we are facing the same problem. In Malaysia alone, for example, we have 120 people, and not many people actually, compared with Europe. Indonesia is slightly higher, around 600, I think. They consist of male, basically mostly male going there, but some of them going there with the families, some of them getting married in there, and they have children. So in my view, because I have following this, people are traveling to conflict zone, I try to make comparison between our experience in Afghanistan before, in the 80s and 90s. We do not have repatriation policy, but now we do have the repatriation policy, which I believe that a quite big change. We learn from the past, from the previous experiences, that we need this repatriation and rehabilitation. I think this is something good. So after the conflict is over, many of them actually, especially whenever they have their husband died in the battle, so they have women and children in there. So this is the big question then for our authorities, whether or not to bring them back. So after the long debate, because some opposition internally, they disagree with the government's decision to bring them back. However, after considering on the legal obligation, moral obligation, as well as humanitarian ground, Malaysian authorities finally decided to bring them home. So this led me to touch on the second part of the discussion, that is, what are the approaches taken by Malaysian government? I would like to mention 5 things that we do here in Malaysia regarding the returnees. One is the repatriation, meaning that it is funded by the state, interagency working together, foreign ministries, our police, national police, and also the multiple agencies involved to fund these Malaysian women and children, including the male, to bring them back here to Malaysia. However, we do not allow them to go back home. We need some kind of assessment done on them, interrogation, as well as the psychological security assessment. That is the first. Second one is the legal approach. Some male returnees, they engage in the battle, right? They, based on the interrogation, based on the information received from the foreign intelligence on the ground, from Turkey and also from Syrian security services. So these individuals were interrogated, and then the legal approach is applied on them based on the terrorism law that we have. However, what happened to the women and children? So we treated them differently, because we also, like in Europe, we consider them as the victim of the situation, because some women and children who went there because they were following their husband without actually wanted to follow them in the first place. They were deceived that they were going for honeymoon in Istanbul, but whenever they are in Istanbul, they say that, okay, let us move to Syria. So they have people there pick them up and cross the border, and then they were left in the jungle, in the mountain, in the desert. So they have to go through the tough journey. So that's the reason why we wanted to bring them back home here. So there is a kind of psychological assessment done on them for the children and women, and rehabilitation program as well, especially whenever they have certain ideology, certain belief. So I think this is very similar as well in the context of Europe, presented by Shulpon just now. The religious scholars involved, psychologists involved. So that is number two. Sorry, that's number three. One is the repatriation. Second is the legal approach. And the third one is the rehabilitation. So we come to the rehabilitation is also included as part of the approach for the women and also children. So there would be assessment, there would be rehabilitation, religious as well as the skill-based kind of trainings. And number four is reintegration. We allow them to return home with their families, and if possible, they want to work, they want to find to further their studies, they can do so, but within certain limits, because they were under monitoring. So that is number five. That is continuous monitoring for those people who return back from this conflict zone. We are afraid actually if suddenly they decided to contact with their friends and get involved in the militant activities. So these are the five things that we do here in Malaysia. However, I also can see that there are some challenges that we would have. One is psychological assessment. Those people who coming back from conflict zone, I have the sense that we need to develop a special assessment tool on them, not to use the ordinary psychological assessment, because they were exposed to kind of traumatic experience. That's number one. The other one is ideological assessment also need to be done, because to some extent they were exposed to certain beliefs, certain ideology, and the children also, they have certain kind of exposure to this kind of ideology. So we need to develop new assessment tools. And we are in Malaysia, we are trying to do that. Second one is the resource, the financial resources. We also facing the same problem, I think, because of the limitation of that, we cannot do a lot of things, especially the programs. And the final point I would like to mention is that I would like to thank the Bulan Institute for organizing this discussion. I would say this is an exchange of experience is very important. And I think that it is in future, perhaps that we can have like Asia, Europe, rehabilitation and reintegration programs discussing about the subject, and we can learn from each other, especially in terms of the, the best practices or the model that the European are using, and how can we apply in our context as well. I think this kind of experience sharing like this one is very, very useful. And some challenges that European have and what we have here in the Southeast Asia, we can have this kind of exchange, and that would be beneficial. So I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Mohammadi. As you said, it's quite interesting to understand the different approaches that are undertaken by different regions. and thank you so much for all the important work that you're doing. Our final panelist is Ms. Christina Matei. Ms. Matei is a program manager within the Capacity Building Programs Department at Hedaya and has been working there since 2015. Ms. Matei also leads the Returning Foreign Terrorist Fighters program in Tunisia, among several major programs, and manages major capacity building programs focused on rehabilitation and reintegration, education, community engagement and policing, and national action plans. She has extensive experience in working with social workers, psychologists, youth workers in CVE, and is focused on information gathering practices and social needs assessments. Ms. Matei, based on the work that Hedaya does, could you please tell us what are some of the good practices that you see around the world? What is the efficacy of rehabilitation programs in general, and how important are they for peace building efforts?
Thank you so much for the kind question. So I'd like to start first by thanking the Bulan Insitute for the kind invitation to this event. It's an honor for me to be part on behalf of Hedaya. So in my intervention today, I will actually focus on a compendium of good practices on rehabilitations and reintegration that Hedaya has just quite recently launched last December, actually. And this is the blueprint of our rehabilitation and reintegration center for returning foreign terrorist fighters and their family members. So I would actually go into some practices in this compendium. So I will start by saying that, as we know, there are thousands of suspected foreign terrorist fighters that have been captured in Syria and Iraq. And additionally, we also know that there are an average of 11 foreign women and children currently in Al-Hol camp. And since 2017, countries have begun to repatriate, as we've seen in the contributions and the interventions also from the rest of the colleagues in this panel. However, the number of countries repatriating peaked in 2019 and then started to decline in the past couple of years, primarily due to COVID-19. So while countries are taking different responses to the issue, it is still globally recognized that governments must be adequately prepared for if and when individuals are actually being repatriated or present in their countries. In this regard, as I mentioned, I'll be focusing on this compendium of practices launched in December. This is a document that has been developed in partnership with several expert practitioners. It contains 143 guiding principles for the effective establishment and implementations of a rehabilitation and reintegration center or a program. So as I said, we took actually quite a holistic approach. We collected input from so many countries, so many expert practitioners as well, through comprehensive survey, one-to-one interviews, and a series of workshops. So based on these contributions, we were able to actually come up with such a document. So this document is broken down into 8 chapters, ranging from legal and policy frameworks to external interventions and reintegration. And each chapter is divided into specific sections. So for example, in chapter 6, on assessing the clients, we focus on information gathering, trust building, intake procedure, assessment, and client plans. And we obviously also focus on some of the points and questions raised by our colleague as well, Ahmed Al-Muhammadi, in his intervention. Under these sections, we have set out this guiding principle, and the key point of this document, but in general of rehabilitations and reintegration, is that there is not one single pathway to rehabilitations and reintegrations, and we need to look into the current context. Also, we need to look at available resources, the country-specific reality, the existing infrastructures, and also the gender dynamics as well are very important. This enables every country to take in a way their own pathway. And there was a specific intention to make this practical. And so we included also 15 case studies and numerous checklists that address many topics, including, for example, standard operating procedure, physical spaces requirements. So the first chapter of the blueprint relates to international and national legislation and policy. And one of the key options here that is proposed to the reader is whether the government chooses to build upon existing mechanisms and frameworks that govern the existing correctional facilities, or whether it seeks to establish a new frameworks and regulation. The second chapter instead looks very much on governance and oversight. So we talk about roles and responsibility, leadership and budgets. And I know that this is like something that is not taken into immediate due consideration, but it's actually extremely important for a government to look into the budgetary, the roles and responsibility as well into the center, the actual standard operating procedures. The third chapter is also focused and investigates another aspects important for rehabilitation and reintegration, which is frequently underexplored. And this is the physical structure, the physical resources, the physical space of the center. The rehabilitations and reintegration programs actually heavily rely on the surrounding space of the center. So government institution, it's extremely important like that they also assess how the physical setting of the center would look like, the spaces where these rehabilitations could take place. And as well in this chapter, we would look into the location of the center. So one option, of course, is looking at placing the center or the rehabilitation facilities closer to the communities of origins of the returnees to facilitate their reintegration. Or there are also other options, for example, closer more to government institutions to facilitate processes and transporting. So again, there are many options here and there is not one size fits all. The next chapter, the fourth, actually looks at human resources. That is, again, we feel that there is a lot of good practice here that needs to be shared. There are obviously many options depending on whether the returnees go through the prison system or specifically in established centers. But one of the most important consideration is in relation to training new staff. And in this regard, one recommendation is definitely to look at local staff, local actors, and additional resources available in the community. So again, governments needs to prepare a holistic analysis of all available tools and resources in the communities where they plan the rehabilitations and reintegrations of the individuals. Another important chapter is that we actually look a lot, we consider, especially during also our capacity building trainings as a DIA, is the issue of the practitioner safety, the client safety. This is something that our psychologists, our social workers in our trainings, in our workshop always ask. And we're not talking about only physical security, but also mental well-being. There have been reports and incidents of also practitioners self-radicalizing sometimes, or also having issues of burnout for the emotional stress. And I think this is an important element when it comes to rehabilitations and reintegration. If we want to make it effective, we know we need also to have effective personnel. And then finally, chapter 6, assessing the clients, is not the final chapter actually, but is one of the most rich. We provide a number of options for risk assessment tools that could be adopted and tailored, as well as needs assessment tool. And at Haridaya, we place a very strong emphasis on the use of the needs assessment, and where relevant in conjunction, of course, with risk assessment. And why? Because through needs assessment, practitioners are able to better understand also the reason, the needs that these violent extremist groups feel at the time of their recruitment. And we think that this is an extremely important information that needs to be gathered to form an effective rehabilitation plan. Chapter 7, we look at, again, suggested options for rehabilitations. And we have included a comprehensive list that could be adopted by each center. So this range from counseling, motivational interviewing, religious counseling, vocational training, and recreational activity, such as sports and arts. We know that the interventions adopted by each country should be tailored, obviously, to their own context, and then tailored to each individuals as the result of the needs and risk assessment tools will provide information for that. So again, even here, one size does not fit all. And obviously, while we have like an issues with resources available, it is still important that we look at the individual level to really try to see what are the needs, specific needs that we can fill through our rehabilitation intervention. In the final chapter, we address reintegration. And here is where I would say there is, we come to one of the most common challenge, and we've seen this in some of the previous presentation, is the issue of community rejection and stigmatization of former violent extremist offenders. And this chapter provides a number of possible options that governments can use to overcome this, the problem. One thing that for sure we emphasize is the importance of engaging the communities and relevant actors from the very start, early on, and not at the end of the process, not when the returnee is going to be released in the community. It's not about also sensitizing the community and informing of what's happening. It's also about identifying the condition under which the community members will be willing to accept these returnees back. They need to be part of the program. They need to be part of the process and not just as a passive actors. Because at the end of the day, we could do everything right, but if the community does not accept the returnees, there is a chance that they will seek out their former group where they were accepted, and then we face the risk of recidivism. So hence, in reality, the community holds a lot of power over the success of our rehabilitation program and should be taken into account appropriately from the early start. One recommendation in our blueprint is, for example, in some centers, some program, also to create a sort of unit in the center itself or in the prison that early on seeks to establish these ties and these communication channels with the relevant community leaders, for example. So this was a very quick overview, the quickest possible for such a comprehensive document. And obviously, I would like to encourage each of the attendees to seek out the blueprint document on our website, which is also currently being translated in Arabic, French, and Albanian. There are many other good practices. I tried to highlight the most important ones in relation to the community's engagements, the assessment, the physical space, the structure, and the governance and oversight. And I'm available for any questions. And thank you very much again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ms. Matei, for not just your insightful comments, but also all the work that Hede has been doing in counterterrorism. So now we'll quickly move on to the Q&A session. And I'll start off with a question for Ms. Sjoberg. Ms. Sjoberg, so we learned that Fight for Humanity actually has a team in Northeast Syria, which they recently went to. My question is about the situation in the camps. Could you share any new updates with us in that regard? What is the situation in the camps like right now for women and children? And how has COVID impacted the situation? Because we've heard that COVID has been spreading quite rapidly there.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, indeed, we have a team that is permanently based in Northeast Syria, and we had also a team that went from Geneva, just came back last week. We were there for 20 days. So we don't directly work in the camps, but we are informed by the situation in camps by others. So basically, we work mainly in other areas. But in terms of the impact, so I think we can see indeed that the COVID cases are incrementing a lot. There has been the cases are doubling by the week, and this is only the known cases. So to keep in mind that basically the testing capacity is very low. So you would only have 1,600 cases basically, but the positivity rate is around 50%. So meaning that we have no idea what is the actual rate. And we think also somehow people don't have access to vaccines. So basically people get used to somehow the fact that they will catch COVID, basically, because the structures that are in place are so insufficient. And particularly if we look at the situation, I mean, we mentioned before the situations in the camps that are so desperate from a humanitarian perspective. We know also there's a big water crisis in Northeast Syria in general. So this is also for sure affecting the camps. So basically, we know how important it is with COVID to wash your hands, etc., alcohol gel. So this is all almost impossible, right, for the people in the camp. And also, as you can imagine, in a crowded situation like in a camp, social distancing is also very, very difficult. So we don't have any figures for the camps indeed, but we know that the figures are rampant, and also the authorities are now taking a lot of measures to try to stop the spread, mainly of the Delta variant. So all type of gatherings have been banned, etc., and they are moving potentially towards a possible full lockdown. So yeah. And then, I mean, adding on that, we know for sure that there's a health and medical crisis, and particularly in the camps, of course, with new COVID cases. That's just kind of adding to the desperate situation. I think just to mention, in addition, I mean, you might have seen recently that there's an incrementation in violent attacks in the camps. So I think we have seen in Al-Hol, there have been some 75 killings just this year. So that's also a really kind of situation of increased insecurity that is affecting everyone who's living there, and also the organizations who are trying to operate. So including those who are trying to operate COVID programs. So yes, this is quite difficult.
Thank you so much, Ms. Shobak. Dr. El-Ahmadi, my next question is for you, and it's a bit of an elongated question, so please bear with me for a bit. So one thing that you said in your presentation that sort of stuck with me was how there is constant monitoring for returnees, and of course that is quite important, and it's a major part of how reintegration programs work. But I was wondering, how do the monitoring programs function, and what sort of limitations could they place on the lives of returnees? And what mechanisms are put in place to sort of guarantee that returnees are being integrated while at the same time being monitored?
Thank you very much for the question. I think this is very important. We do the monitoring because we learned from the past that there were the cases of recidivism taking place, especially among the former members of Jemaah Islamiyah in the Southeast Asia. Even though we have good successful rate of rehabilitation, 300 people went through rehabilitation, we have 7 cases of recidivism. And from there, then we learned that there is a need for a continuous monitoring. The term maybe sounds very technical, but actually it's combination between formal and informal relations between the authorities and the former returnees or the detainees. So there would be one person in charge of every returnees, or maybe one person in charge for every 10 returnees, for example. So this officer would check out from time to time, making a phone call, pay a visit, but not just official visit, but sometimes the visit, especially during the festival day or the celebration for National Day, for example, or whenever their family or the children want to go to school at the beginning of the school years, they would pay a visit and give out some money or any kind of assistance that the family needs. The intention for this relationship is to have a sustainable contact, so that anything that they are facing, like the trouble, the challenge, they can cater that challenges, so that they do not go out, meaning that seeking out for information, for help, assistance from their groups that they used to join before. And the community also played the role. For example, the local mosque, the imam, and the local leaders, they also play a very important role, as well as the families, meaning that the successful rehabilitation program and reintegration program must look into the families as well, not just the person, because family provide the support system. So we also need to engage, pay the visit to the family, know their family, and make sure that the issue of stigmatization mentioned by Maria just now is addressed. So we do not want to make them feel that they were stigmatized by society. We want to make sure that the society embraced them. So by having this kind of environment, so this is how the surveillance and monitoring is taking place. So they do not feel that they were under monitoring, but they feel like they have a continuous relationship with the former officer that they used to deal before. That's the meaning of monitoring.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for that detailed answer. My next question is to Ms. Razdikova, and I'd really appreciate if Ms. Orozubekova could help us translate that. So more than 2 years have passed since Kazakhstan's stellar rehabilitation program has started, and it has offered lessons to many countries. In our research, we see that it has done a very good job of sort of making sure that rates of recidivism are low, reintegration methods are done excruciatingly well. Ms. Razdikova, could you share with us briefly some of your main outcomes on your successes? And what sort of behavioral change have you been able to induce in returnees, especially when we talk about female returnees and children?
Спасибо. Во-первых, выражаю благодарность организаторам.
Thank you very much. To the co-organizers.
Спасибо. Спасибо за интерес, который проявляете к нашим реабилитационным программам.
Thank you for the interest to the rehabilitation program in Kazakhstan.
Ну, хочу сказать, что было эвакуировано 137 женщин. На сегодняшний день мы официально заявляем, что 95% из этих женщин полностью реабилитированы.
137 women were repatriated in general, and we can say now that 95% of them fully rehabilitated.
Ну, какие успехи? В первую очередь мы хотим сказать о том, что было создано волонтерское движение среди репатриантов по дерадикализации других женщин, ну, других радикалов.
The main outcome, I would like to highlight that there was a group of volunteers among female returnees who are involved in the rehabilitation program, and they work to de-radicalize other returnees.
В том числе и женщин, которых сидят в тюрьмах, они будут с ними работать.
And they are going to work with those female returnees who are arrested and who are still in the jail, in prison.
В течение 2 лет мы готовили этих женщин и с психологической точки зрения, и с религиозной точки зрения.
During these 2 years, we prepared them psychologically and also giving knowledge, so they are ready now to work.
В этом году 2 женщины из этой группы поступили в теологический университет города Алматы, то есть они будут дипломированными теологами.
Two women who are female returnees, they this year they were accepted to this university. It's faculty of theology, so they are going to become professional theologians.
Некоторая группа женщин подготовлены и выступают на международных площадках и заявляют о том, что они не жертвы терроризма, а борцы с терроризмом.
And several women who are volunteers, they usually start speaking in different platforms in international conferences, and they say that they are not now victims of terrorism, but they fight terrorism.
Thank you so much, Ms. Razdikova and Ms. Orozubekova. It's always very fascinating to hear success stories from around the world, especially considering the sheer complexity of the challenge in question. My next question is to Ms. Matei. Ms. Matei, we know that you've been working in Tunisia, and as we know that Tunisia has repatriated its citizens from Northeast Syria. So what are some of the good practices we can learn from Tunisia, and could you share some of those? And particularly, could you reflect a bit on the differences and similarities between the Tunisian experience and the Central Asian experience?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, I'm not really in the best position to speak on behalf of the Tunisian colleagues that we've been working on, but I mean, I'll try my best. I mean, it's a little bit not my place to speak on behalf of the Tunisians, but I mean, I've been working there since 2017, actually 2016, immediately after the National Counter-Terrorism Commission of Tunisia was established. And I would say that the main good practices that I've seen and I've learned personally in the Tunisian context has been their ability to quickly establish ties with the civil society organizations when it comes to the rehabilitations and reintegration. They actually involved the civil society, which is quite active in Tunisia, in a number of platforms, such as the counter-narrative platforms in Tunisia, but also like in a number of other initiatives under the umbrella of the CT Commission, the National Counterterrorism Commission. Other lessons learned, of course, I mean, and we know that engaging with the civil society, as I mentioned in my contribution, is extremely important, especially if you want to seek you know, to gain that public support for the reintegrations of the returnees. They also had quite an interesting, especially with respect to children, they actually have quite an interesting, I would say, memorandum of understanding, if we can call it this way. I mean, again, not able to really technically speak on their behalf, but they had established this type of communication channel between the Delegate for the Protection of Children, which is this sort of super partners institution that looks after the rights of the children, and the rehabilitation centers in the community and the detention centers, the child detention centers. They have these three main institutions that have been established communication channels, and they've been trying to really like work as a sort of multi-agency unit to tackle this problem, which is again one of the major challenges in rehabilitations and reintegration, because from a government institutional perspective, there is lots of unclarity in terms of roles and responsibility across ministries sometimes. So they really tried their best from the bottom, like really like at the practitioners level, to create a sort of environment where practitioners from different institutions could also collaborate and share information. I mean, obviously it is a work in progress, but I think that it's something that I was very impressed, and for me it's obviously an honor, because I can actually see and learn from an actual experience in the country.
With that, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our incredible discussion. Hopefully, we all have a lot of food for thought after listening to our speakers. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their very intriguing contributions and inputs throughout the session. It is definitely a very interesting and rapidly progressing theme that researchers in the field are all still trying to understand and make sense of. We hope that the best practices from Central Asia and all around the world are used as cases of study to better understand this very complex subject and realize that ultimately there are no easy or straight answers. Finally, to our audience at the Geneva Peace Week, we'd like to extend a very warm note of appreciation for watching the entire session. We would love to hear from you on your thoughts, on your research, on your opinions on the issue. So feel free to write into either the Fight for Humanity or the Bulan Institute. We hope you continue to have an incredible time at the Geneva Peace Week, and we look forward to engaging with all of you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, thank you.